I wasn't supposed to understand a single word he was saying. The hallway was dark except for the thin strip of light spilling out from under Brian's office door. I had walked past it 100 times before without thinking. But that night something in his voice made me slow down. He was laughing, not the polite, practiced laugh he used with coworkers on video calls, but the relaxed, careless one he only used when he thought he was safe. He was speaking Spanish. "She has no idea," he said. His tone light, amused. A woman laughed on the other end. "Natalie." I stood still, my hand resting against the wall, my heart beginning to beat in a way that felt loud enough to betray me. He kept talking. About money. About timing. About Friday. He said that after the contract signing, he would file for divorce. He said he'd already moved most of the joint funds somewhere I couldn't see. He said that once everything expanded in the system, no one would question it. And then he said something else. Something about patient files. About access. About cleaning logs. Natalie laughed again. "She doesn't understand Spanish," he told her. I understood every word. I didn't burst into the room. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I just stood there in the dark, listening to my marriage end in a language he thought I couldn't speak. When the call ended, I stayed frozen for another few seconds, waiting for my breathing to steady. I could hear Brian's chair scrape against the hardwood floor. A drawer opened, closed. His footsteps moved toward the kitchen. I slipped quietly into the guest bathroom and turned on the faucet just long enough to make it sound like I had been there the whole time. By the time I walked into the kitchen, he was pouring himself a glass of water. "Hey," he said casually. "You still working?" "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Just finishing up." He nodded, smiling the same familiar smile I had trusted for 8 years. "Big day Friday," he added. "After that, things are going to change." I looked at him carefully. "Change how?" He shrugged. "Promotion opportunities. Bigger responsibilities. You know how it is." I nodded, pretending I didn't know exactly how it was. He kissed my forehead and went upstairs. I stood there in the kitchen alone, my pulse finally slowing into something colder, clearer. It wasn't the affair that made my chest tighten. It wasn't even the divorce plan. It was the word access. And the phrase "clean the logs." I went back to my office and closed the door quietly. My laptop was still open, a half-written e-commerce optimization report glowing on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before pushing it aside. Brian thought I didn't understand finance. He thought I didn't understand systems. He had spent years making jokes about my cute little websites and my work-from-home flexibility. He had told people I dabbled in code. He had once told a neighbor I barely passed high school Spanish. What he conveniently forgot was that I had lived in San Diego for 2 years before we met. That I had worked almost exclusively with Latino small business owners. That I negotiated contracts in Spanish before he ever learned to say hola without an accent. More importantly, he forgot that last year, when his department was short-staffed, I helped him configure a sandbox security layer for the healthcare network he supported. I built test permissions. I generated a secondary credential for penetration simulations. He promised he would deactivate it after deployment. I had never confirmed that he did. I checked the time. Wednesday night. The signing ceremony was Friday evening in downtown Denver. He had said that once the contract expanded, no one would question it. That meant new permissions, new privileges, and possibly the ability to erase whatever he had already done. I opened a fresh terminal window and stared at the login prompt longer than I cared to admit. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They felt steady, deliberate. I typed in the old sandbox credential. For a second, nothing happened. Then the dashboard loaded. Access granted. A quiet, almost polite message appeared at the top of the screen. Test profile active? I leaned back slowly in my chair. The system overview populated with live data. I navigated to audit logs. My eyes scanned quickly. Years of pattern recognition kicking in automatically. Export events. Timestamp clusters. Late-night sessions. There were multiple data exports tagged under Brian's admin profile. The volumes were too large for routine analytics. My stomach tightened. I clicked deeper into one of the sessions from 2 nights ago. The destination field was masked under a third-party vendor name. But I recognized the structure. That wasn't routine system maintenance. I opened a separate window and began copying visible logs into a secure folder on my encrypted drive. I named the folder one word: Friday. If he was planning to clean the logs after the contract expansion, then whatever I preserved now might be the only untouched version left. I checked user permission updates scheduled for Friday night. A new admin layer was set to activate at midnight following the signing event. Brian's profile would gain expanded deletion authority. My jaw tightened. He hadn't just planned a divorce. He had planned timing. He had planned expansion. He had planned to make sure that whatever he did could be buried under a larger system update. I pulled up export session details and noticed something else. One of the data pulls referenced a restricted clinical trial dataset. My breath caught. That wasn't public billing information. That wasn't harmless analytics. That was protected. I saved the file reference, then the timestamp, then the associated IP routing details. The house was silent around me. Upstairs, I could hear Brian moving across the bedroom floor, unaware that every assumption he made about me had just collapsed. He thought I didn't understand Spanish. He thought I didn't understand systems. He thought I would find out about the divorce after everything was already gone. I stared at the glowing screen, watching a new line of activity refresh in the audit panel. The access was still active. And now, so was I. I woke up before Brian did and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing like it belonged to a stranger. For a few seconds, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. The Spanish, the laughter, the word divorce floating casually between them like it was a dinner reservation. Then he rolled over, wrapped an arm around my waist, and kissed my shoulder. "Morning," he murmured. I swallowed the instinct to pull away. "Morning." He got up, showered, and came downstairs whistling softly. By the time I joined him in the kitchen, he was already dressed for work. Crisp button down, confidence pressed into every crease. "Big week," he said, pouring coffee. "Friday's going to be huge." "I know," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He leaned against the counter. "They're talking about expanding the integration across multiple states. If that happens, it changes everything." There it was again. Change. He glanced at me. "You want to come Friday night? It's at the Hilton downtown. Might be kinda boring for you, though. Corporate stuff. Boring for me." I smiled faintly. "I'll see." He nodded like he had expected that answer all along. Like I would stay home. Unaware. Unimportant. "Before leaving," he added, "you know, after this week, we might need to revisit how we manage finances. Bigger responsibilities, bigger risks." I met his eyes. "Revisit how?" He shrugged. "Just restructuring, consolidation. Smarter oversight? Oversight." He kissed my cheek and left. The door closed behind him, and the house fell silent in a way that felt heavier than usual. I walked back to my office and shut the door gently. The evidence folder I had created the night before glowed quietly from my encrypted drive. Friday. I replayed his tone in my head. He had been so sure, so comfortable. Brian had always liked being the one in control. Not in obvious ways. He didn't shout or slam doors. He corrected. He advised. He clarified. When we first married in Chicago, he insisted on being the primary account holder for our joint banking because he liked structure. When I questioned a suspicious charge once, he told me I was overthinking small numbers. Small numbers. Meanwhile, my freelance projects had grown steadily. E-commerce frameworks, payment gateway optimization, security audits for mid-size retailers. I earned more than he did in the last 2 years, but he still referred to my work as flexible. Flexible meant optional in his vocabulary. I logged back into the system dashboard using the sandbox credential. Still active. I navigated to permission settings and compared current privileges with those scheduled for Friday night. A new admin layer was queued to activate automatically at midnight after the contract signing. Brian's profile would gain expanded deletion rights across audit logs. I clicked into recent export sessions again. Multiple large data transfers occurred over the last 3 weeks. Most were tagged under a third-party analytics vendor. But the timing was suspicious, almost always between 11 p.m. and 2 m. I opened the detailed log view and noticed something subtle. One of the export sessions had been routed through a test environment node, the exact sandbox layer I had helped configure last year. My stomach tightened. He hadn't just forgotten to deactivate my credential. He was using the structure I built. I downloaded the visible export summaries and cross-referenced them with system change logs. The pattern was deliberate. Data export. Minor internal configuration change. Silence. Then I opened our shared financial dashboard. 3 separate transfers had been made over the past 2 weeks, each just under mandatory reporting thresholds. The destination account was masked under a generic LLC payment reference. I searched the name in the transaction memo. Arizona. My chest went cold. I opened a new browser tab and pulled up public business registry records. The LLC had been formed 3 weeks ago. The registered mailing address matched a physical therapy clinic in Scottsdale. Natalie's clinic. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't sloppy. It was structured. He had formed an LLC. He had moved funds in structured amounts. He had scheduled system privilege expansion. He had prepared a narrative. I returned to the audit logs and filtered by credential reference. My sandbox ID appeared in the metadata of one recent configuration change. That shouldn't have been possible. I had not accessed the system until last night, which meant someone had modified attribution trails. A chill moved down my spine. If data exports were traced back to a sandbox credential labeled as legacy test, it could look like an old configuration oversight. It could look like my oversight. I opened the export labeled from 2 nights ago. Clinical trial restricted. The file size was large enough to contain raw participant data. This was no longer just about money. I ran a quick cross-check on permission escalation timelines. Friday at midnight. Brian's expanded privileges would include direct authority to purge historical audit entries older than 30 days without secondary approval. The exports began 23 days ago. He had timed it carefully. I glanced at the clock. Wednesday afternoon. Less than 48 hours. My pulse steadied instead of racing. He thought I didn't understand Spanish. He thought I didn't understand finance. He thought I didn't understand system architecture. What he didn't understand was that I documented everything. I created a structured timeline file and began mapping events. Data export 1, 3 weeks ago, same week Arizona LLC registered. Data export 2, 2 weeks ago, first structured transfer from joint account. Data export 3, 2 nights ago, restricted clinical trial dataset. Scheduled privilege expansion, Friday midnight. I copied each log entry, preserving metadata. Then I opened our shared email archive. A draft message from Brian to someone named N. L. Consulting referenced final integration after Friday. N. L. Natalie's initials. My phone buzzed suddenly. A text from Brian. Did you access anything on my system today? I stared at the screen. No. I typed back. 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared. The message vanished. He had deleted it. I set my phone down slowly. He was checking. Testing. I closed the dashboard and encrypted the updated evidence file. As I labeled the newest folder segment, my eyes landed again on the Arizona registry page. The LLC formation date was exactly 3 days after his first unauthorized data export. That wasn't coincidence. That was planning. I exhaled slowly and opened a new encrypted folder inside Friday. I named it Clinical, because whatever he thought he was cleaning up after midnight, he wasn't counting on me being awake before then. The file labeled Clinical Trial, restricted, stayed open on my screen long after I stopped moving the mouse. I had worked on enough security-sensitive platforms to know what that label meant. Restricted clinical data wasn't just another spreadsheet. It contained participant records, treatment notes, internal research metrics, the kind of information protected by layers of federal regulation. Brian hadn't just exported billing summaries. He had touched something untouchable. I zoomed into the metadata and checked the timestamp again. 2 nights ago, 12:43 in the morning. The session lasted 18 minutes and 41 seconds. Long enough to transfer something substantial. I opened a terminal and ran a deeper log comparison using my own forensic scripts. The visible dashboard only showed summary entries, but raw system calls told a clearer story. Multiple export sessions had been initiated over the past 3 weeks, each one slightly larger than the last. This wasn't panic behavior. This was escalation. I traced routing pathways attached to the export events. Most were masked under a third-party analytics vendor account. But one session revealed partial IP forwarding data. The traffic wasn't local. It had been tunneled. I leaned closer to the screen and followed the routing trail. The data didn't stop in Arizona. It bounced through a server cluster that redirected traffic offshore. Eastern Europe. My jaw tightened. No healthcare IT specialist accidentally routes protected clinical data through offshore nodes. I cross-referenced the export timestamps with our financial records again. The pattern aligned too cleanly to ignore. Export 1. 3 days later. The Arizona LLC registered. Export 2. 48 hours later. Structured transfer from our joint account. Export 3. 2 nights ago. And this morning, I noticed a pending outgoing wire labeled consulting settlement. Consulting. I opened the transaction details and checked the scheduled processing time. Friday afternoon. Just hours before the signing ceremony. I minimized the banking window and pulled up the mortgage application file I had discovered earlier. The digital signature field listed my name. But I knew I hadn't signed anything. I downloaded the PDF and inspected the metadata. The signature was applied from an IP address registered to Brian's office network. He had forged it. 70% of the down payment on this house had come from my performance bonus 2 years ago. I had wired it myself. He was trying to leverage it again without me knowing? My stomach turned. But my mind stayed clear. I opened the audit log comparison again and noticed something I hadn't caught the night before. One of the recent configuration changes had reassigned attribution metadata to my sandbox credential. That credential had not been used in over a year. Except now, in the logs. It appeared as if it had been active during one of the early export sessions. That wasn't oversight. That was staging. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. He wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to blame. If the data breach was discovered after the system expansion, it could appear as though a legacy test credential, mine, had been exploited. He would discover it. He would report it. He would be the hero cleaning up a breach caused by his wife's old access. And I would be the liability. My phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. A notification from our bank. Action required. Mortgage confirmation pending. Final cosigner review due Friday at noon. I opened the details. The cosigner listed was the Arizona LLC. My chest went cold again. He was tying the house to Natalie's shell company. If the loan processed before I intervened, equity could shift in ways that would take months to unwind. I closed the notification and opened the Arizona registry page once more. I dug deeper into related filings. The LLC's operating agreement wasn't public, but a secondary business filing revealed another name linked to the marketing analytics vendor. Natalie's brother. I remembered Brian mentioning once that Natalie had family in tech. This wasn't a romantic escape plan. This was monetization. My screen refreshed automatically as new log entries appeared. Another export session. Active. Right now. I checked the time. 11:38 p.m. Brian was upstairs, supposedly asleep beside our bed. I ran a quick process trace and confirmed the session was initiated through remote VPN access. He had scheduled it. I stood up slowly and walked quietly down the hallway, listening. The bedroom door was closed. The house was still. I returned to my office and began recording the live log session, capturing every line of code, every transfer packet reference. I traced the routing again. This time, the offshore node appeared more clearly before the connection masked itself under the analytics vendor alias. He wasn't even hiding the volume anymore. The transfer completed at 11:56 p.m. 4 minutes before midnight. 4 minutes before his future expanded privileges would allow deeper deletion authority. He was building a buffer zone. I encrypted the recording and uploaded it to an independent secure vault under third-party timestamp verification. If he attempted to alter logs later, the discrepancy would be measurable. I closed my eyes for a second and exhaled slowly. This had moved beyond infidelity, beyond money. This was conspiracy. I opened a blank document and began drafting a structured timeline. Wednesday night, overheard call in Spanish. Admission of divorce plan. Mention of cleaning logs. Thursday early morning, active offshore transfer session. Mortgage fraud pending confirmation Friday noon. Scheduled admin privilege expansion Friday midnight. If he executed the purge script after midnight, older audit entries could be erased, unless they were preserved elsewhere. I saved the document and labeled it Evidence Master Timeline. Upstairs, the house remained silent. I glanced at the clock again. Thursday was almost over. One more day. He believed Friday would secure his escape. He didn't know that every minute he waited gave me more leverage. My eyes returned to the audit dashboard as it refreshed. The access was still active, and now I understood the full scope of what he was trying to bury. The overseas routing trail kept pulling me back to the screen. I zoomed in on the destination node again, isolating the masked forwarding address and stripping away the alias layer piece by piece. What had looked like a generic analytics endpoint was actually a proxy server registered to a holding company I had never heard of before. The registration date was 2 months ago. I opened a corporate search database and ran the holding company's name through public filings. It took less than 5 minutes to find a secondary entity tied to it. The Arizona LLC. I followed the connection further. The holding company listed a minority stakeholder under a different surname, but the mailing address matched the Scottsdale clinic where Natalie worked. I felt something inside me shift from anger to precision. This wasn't just an affair wrapped in bad judgment. It was structured collaboration. I remembered Brian mentioning once that Natalie was good with investors and had family connections in analytics. At the time, I had barely listened. Now I was reading the names for myself. One of the analytics vendor's corporate officers shared a last name with Natalie. A quick public search confirmed it. Her brother. This was deeper than I thought. I leaned back in my chair and replayed Wednesday night's voicemail from memory. After Friday, we're clear. Clear. Clear of what? The audit logs answered that question. I pulled up the purge script scheduled to execute Friday night. It was embedded within a broader system maintenance batch. Clean formatting, professional syntax, automatic deletion parameters. I scrolled carefully through the deletion queue. There it was. Sandbox credential, legacy test breach. My credential. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. He wasn't just planning to erase evidence. He was planning to leave my name behind. If regulators traced a breach back to a legacy test account, it would appear negligent at best, criminal at worst. And because I had once configured that layer, my involvement could be implied. I opened an archived copy of original system logs from last year and compared attribution fields. The recent modifications were subtle but deliberate. Timestamp edits, credential reassignments. He had manipulated the audit trail. The purge script was scheduled for 11:59 p.m. Friday, 2 minutes after his expanded admin privileges activated. He had built himself a window. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying my breathing. Upstairs, Brian moved around, getting ready for work. It was Thursday morning. I shut down the live dashboard and walked into the kitchen. He was pouring cereal, scrolling on his phone. "You're up early," he said casually. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. He studied me briefly. "You look tired. Maybe you're working too much." "Working too much?" I watched him carefully. How's everything at your end? He shrugged. Busy. But after Friday, things smooth out. He poured milk like we were discussing weekend plans instead of a federal violation. As he grabbed his keys, he paused. You've backed up your own stuff lately. Right. Just good practice. I met his gaze. I always do. His expression flickered for half a second. Then he smiled and left. The second the door closed. My phone vibrated. A fraud alert from our mortgage lender. Action required. Confirmation pending. I opened the details. The second home equity application was listed as conditionally cleared. Final confirmation required by noon Friday. The cosigner field listed the Arizona LLC again. I felt the weight of it settle. He was trying to shift equity into an entity controlled by Natalie and her family before filing for divorce. I dialed the lender's fraud department immediately. I did not authorize this application, I said calmly. They asked verification questions. I answered each one. We'll flag this for review. The representative told me, but cosigner confirmation is still pending. Pending. Everything was pending until Friday. I returned to my office and reopened the purge script. I screen recorded the entire configuration file, capturing every line, every credential reference, every scheduled timestamp. Then I cross-checked the purge logic against system retention policies. The script would not just remove visible entries. It would rewrite metadata attribution. If executed, it would suggest that the sandbox credential had triggered anomalous exports, followed by automated cleanup. He had created a narrative in code. I exported the script file and ran a checksum validation, preserving its original state under third-party timestamp verification. My phone buzzed again. A short text from Brian. Did you access anything on my work dashboard? No, I replied. 3 dots appeared, then vanished. He was nervous. He should have been. I reopened the Arizona LLC registry and scrolled through related filings again. One amendment had been filed late last night. Operating agreement update. The listed purpose. Healthcare analytics and consulting. Consulting. The same word attached to the pending wire transfer. I opened the bank dashboard and confirmed the outbound wire scheduled for Friday afternoon. If processed, it would move structured funds into a brokerage account under the LLC. Data exported. Money transferred. Logs cleaned. Clear. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall across from me. If I confronted him privately, he would accelerate the purge. If I reported anonymously without full context, he could spin it. Exposure had to happen where he couldn't control the narrative. Friday night. The signing ceremony. Corporate legal present. Compliance officers present. Executives watching. If I revealed the evidence there, it wouldn't just be a marital confrontation. It would be a documented incident. I opened the event announcement email Brian had forwarded me weeks ago. Hilton Denver downtown. 6:30 p.m. Cocktail reception. 7:15 signing. I mapped the timing in my head. Mortgage confirmation deadline, noon Friday. Outbound wire, mid-afternoon Friday. Expanded privileges, midnight Friday. Purge script, 11:59 p.m. He believed he had engineered every variable. He hadn't engineered me. I created a new encrypted file labeled public presentation. Because whatever happened Friday night, it would not be whispered in a hallway. It would be on record. The purge script was more elegant than I expected. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't sloppy. It was written with the kind of quiet efficiency that only comes from someone who believes they won't be questioned. I scrolled slowly through the deletion queue again, isolating the parameters tied to credential reassignment. My sandbox ID appeared under a label. Legacy test breach remediation. Remediation. He had built the ending into the beginning. If regulators ever reviewed the logs after Friday, they would see an old test credential, mine, associated with anomalous export activity. Then they would see a system cleanup routine executed under his expanded privileges. He would appear proactive, responsible, cleaning up a breach caused by someone else. Caused by me. I felt something inside me harden. I opened a separate window and began reconstructing the timeline in reverse. If the purge script was the final act, what story was he telling before that? Export events had started 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago was the same week the Arizona LLC was formed. 3 weeks ago was also when Brian had insisted we simplify our shared banking structure. I opened the joint account dashboard again and filtered transactions by new beneficiaries. 3 transfers, each slightly below mandatory reporting thresholds, each labeled under vague consulting references. The next transfer was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I clicked into the pending wire details. Consulting settlement. Destination. Brokerage account under the Arizona LLC. If that processed before I intervened, the money would be sitting inside an entity partially shielded by corporate structure. I pulled up the LLC registry again and dug deeper into related filings. There was an additional document attached to the holding company overseas, a minority ownership listing. The last name matched the analytics vendor's corporate officer, Natalie's brother. This wasn't 2 people making reckless decisions. This was coordinated. I opened the email thread from the Spanish investor alias I had used earlier and reviewed Natalie's response again. After Friday's integration, volume increases. Volume. She knew exactly what was being exported. My phone buzzed. A new fraud alert. I opened it. Mortgage confirmation reminder. Final cosigner approval pending by Friday at noon. The cosigner was still listed as the Arizona LLC. I forwarded the alert to my own secure email archive and called the bank again to escalate the fraud flag. I documented the time, the representative's name, and the confirmation number. Every move needed a paper trail. Later that afternoon, Brian came home briefly under the pretense of grabbing a different tie for Friday. "You've been quiet today," he said casually, scanning my face. "Busy," I replied. He nodded, then hesitated. "You didn't log into anything on my work network, right?" "IT's been weird lately." I looked at him steadily. "Why would I?" He shrugged. Just checking. I watched him move around the bedroom, humming to himself. The same man who had once told me I worried too much about technical hypotheticals. He left again without another word. The second the door closed, I reopened the purge script and ran a deeper metadata extraction. There was a draft internal memo attached to a staging folder under Brian's admin profile. I downloaded it. The memo outlined a potential legacy access vulnerability discovered after system expansion. It referenced an outdated sandbox credential tied to an external contributor. An external contributor. Me. He had already drafted the explanation. I stared at the document for a long moment. He wasn't planning to react to a breach. He was planning to announce one, and he had written me into the blame. My anger didn't flare. It sharpened. I opened my forensic verification portal and uploaded the purge script, the draft memo, and the export logs for third-party timestamp authentication. If he attempted to execute the purge Friday night, there would be immutable evidence of the pre-existing configuration. My phone vibrated again. A short text from Brian. "Everything's going smoothly. After tomorrow night, we're clean." I stared at the message. "We're clean." That wasn't a husband reassuring his wife. That was a conspirator confirming alignment. A second message appeared a few seconds later. "Delete after reading." The message disappeared before I could screenshot it. But I didn't need to. I already had enough. I reopened the audit log comparison and isolated the session where my sandbox credential had been reassigned in metadata. The timestamp fell on a day I had been in a client video call for 6 straight hours. I still had calendar evidence. I added the calendar record to my evidence folder. Then I created a sealed digital package with instructions. Release if unauthorized system deletion detected. If something happened to the logs after midnight Friday, that package would automatically notify my forensic consultant and attach all preserved files. Insurance. That evening, I checked the bank dashboard one more time. The outbound wire was still pending. The mortgage confirmation still flagged. The purge script still scheduled. He believed he had structured everything so precisely that no one could unwind it. He had structured it against a version of me that no longer existed. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to ruin me financially, legally, professionally before he walked away, and the only reason he thought he could get away with it was because he believed I didn't understand. Spanish. Systems. Him. He was wrong. And by Friday night, he was going to find out exactly how wrong he was. I woke up on Friday with a calm I didn't recognize. It wasn't peace. It wasn't forgiveness.
It was clarity.
Brian was already in the shower when I stepped into the kitchen. I checked my phone before I poured coffee. Mortgage confirmation deadline. 12 p. Outbound wire scheduled. 3 p. Signing ceremony. 6:30 p.m. Expanded privileges activation. Midnight. Purge script. 11:59 po. Everything was still on track. I opened my laptop and logged into the system dashboard again. The sandbox credential remained active. I navigated directly to the purge configuration and began recording a full screen capture, narrating softly under my breath so the audio file would timestamp each section. Deletion queue includes legacy sandbox credential ID. I zoomed in on the credential reference, highlighting the metadata. Then I switched to the admin privilege update schedule. Brian's profile was set to inherit expanded deletion rights automatically at midnight following contract confirmation. He had built himself the authority he needed. I exported both files and uploaded them into the third-party verification vault. A confirmation notification appeared seconds later. Immutable timestamp secured. My phone buzzed. A new outbound transfer appeared in the pending queue. Slightly different description this time. Consulting advance. I copied the transaction ID and saved it. Upstairs. The shower stopped running. I moved quickly. I opened the Spanish investor alias email account and drafted a new message. Buenos días. We are reviewing final documentation before capital allocation. Can you confirm projected data volume increase after tonight's integration? I referenced the healthcare analytics expansion and used language that suggested I already understood the structure. I pressed send. By the time Brian came downstairs dressed in a tailored navy suit, my phone vibrated. Reply from Natalie. Sí. Después de esta noche el volumen aumenta significativamente. Tendremos acceso completo. After tonight, volume increases significantly. We will have full access. I felt something inside me settle. Full access. I archived the email thread with full header metadata. Brian walked into the kitchen adjusting his cufflinks. You sure you don't want to come tonight? He asked casually. I might stop by, I said. He paused for half a second. It's mostly corporate compliance people. Might not be your scene. I'll manage. He nodded slowly. After tonight, he added, we're finally free. Free. He left shortly after. I waited 10 minutes, then reopened the system dashboard. I ran a final check on the purge script. Still scheduled. Still intact. Still including my credential in the deletion queue. I downloaded the script one last time and compared its checksum to the archived copy. Identical. Good. Then I opened the recorded audio from Wednesday night and isolated the line I needed. She doesn't understand Spanish. I enhanced the clarity, trimmed the background noise, and saved it as a separate file. My phone buzzed again. Fraud alert update. Mortgage confirmation paused pending further investigation. I exhaled slowly. One variable neutralized. At 2:47 p.m. The outbound wire attempted to process. Transaction held. Review required. I watched the status change in real time. Second variable neutralized. The system dashboard refreshed automatically. Admin privilege update pre-authorization confirmed for 6 p.m. Earlier than midnight. He had accelerated the timeline. I checked the event schedule email again. Cocktail reception 6:30. Signing 7:15. If the privilege update activated early, he might attempt manual deletion sooner. I opened the remote forensic console and initiated a live monitoring script. If any purge attempt executed, I would see it instantly. At 4 p.m. Brian texted. All set for tonight. Big moment. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened a new document and organized my presentation in concise bullet format. Export logs with timestamps. Restricted clinical trial dataset reference. Arizona LLC formation date. Structured financial transfers. Mortgage fraud metadata. Purge script configuration. Spanish email exchange. Audio clip. Each file labeled clearly. Each in chronological order. I uploaded a duplicate of the entire evidence folder into a timed release legal vault, configured to notify my forensic consultant, and a pre-drafted email address if accessed without authorization. Insurance. At 5:30, I closed my laptop and changed into a simple black dress. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Professional. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. He believed tonight would secure his escape. He believed I would stay home. He believed I didn't understand. I picked up my phone and checked the dashboard one last time before leaving. Admin privilege expansion active. My monitoring script remained in place. The purge script was still scheduled for 11:59. Everything was exactly where he wanted it. I locked the front door behind me and drove downtown. As I pulled into the parking structure beneath the Hilton, my phone vibrated once more. A new system notification. Expanded admin privileges fully confirmed under Brian's profile. He had his authority. Now it was my turn. The ballroom lights were brighter than I expected. Corporate banners lined the walls. The healthcare network's logo projected across a massive screen behind a polished stage. Servers moved between clusters of executives holding wine glasses and speaking in low, confident tones. I paused near the entrance just long enough to scan the room. Brian stood near the front, laughing beside Natalie. She wore a fitted white dress and a badge that read Healthcare Analytics Consultant. She looked comfortable. Belonged. Brian leaned close to a group of men in suits. My wife prefers to stay out of corporate stuff, he was saying casually. She's more into her freelance web projects. Freelance. As if I dabbled. I stepped forward. A few heads turned, but no one stopped me. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't dramatic. I was composed. Brian saw me when I was halfway across the room. His smile froze for a fraction of a second before he recovered.
Chloe,
he said lightly. I didn't think you were coming. I decided to, I replied. Natalie's eyes flicked over me quickly. Calculating. I glanced at my phone. 6:48 p.m. The admin privilege expansion notification had already activated. My monitoring script showed no deletion attempts yet. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 7:15. I moved toward a woman I recognized from the company website, the Chief Compliance Officer. I had memorized her name earlier that afternoon. Excuse me, I said calmly. I'm Chloe. I previously assisted with security module configuration during last year's sandbox deployment. She studied me carefully. Yes, I remember that name from documentation. I need 5 minutes before the signing, I said. There's something you need to see. Her expression shifted slightly. Is this urgent? Yes. Something in my tone must have convinced her. At 7:12, just as the CEO stepped toward the stage with a ceremonial folder, the compliance officer leaned in and spoke quietly to him. The microphone crackled. Before we proceed, the CEO announced, "We've been asked to review a brief technical matter." Murmurs rippled across the room. Brian turned toward the stage, confusion flickering across his face. I walked forward. Every step felt measured. The projection screen lit up with the system dashboard I had mirrored through a secure portal. "This is a live audit log," I said calmly into the handheld microphone. Time-stamped and preserved through third-party verification. The room grew quiet. I pointed to the export session from 2 nights ago. Multiple unauthorized data exports have occurred over the past 3 weeks. I continued, including restricted clinical trial datasets. Brian stepped forward abruptly. "What is this?"
Chloe.
"What are you doing?" I didn't look at him. I highlighted the timestamp cluster and routing path. These exports were tunneled through masked analytics endpoints and forwarded offshore. A murmur spread across the executives. I switched slides. Next appeared the Arizona LLC registry. This entity was formed 3 days after the first export. I zoomed in on the name. Natalie's? Her posture stiffened. I moved to the financial summary. Structured transfers were made from our joint account to a brokerage account under this LLC. A pending wire was scheduled this afternoon. A compliance attorney stepped closer to the screen. Brian's face drained of color. "That's personal," he snapped. "That's not corporate." I cut him off calmly. "It becomes corporate when the funds are tied to data monetization." Natalie leaned toward him and whispered something quickly in Spanish. "No te preocupes," she muttered. "Ella no entiende." "She understands perfectly," I said in Spanish. Turning toward her, the room fell completely silent. Natalie froze. I continued in Spanish. "Después de esta noche, el volumen aumenta significativamente. Tendremos acceso completo." Her exact words from the email. Gasps rippled across the room. Brian stared at me like he had never seen me before. I switched to the final slide. The purge script configuration. "This script is scheduled to execute at 11:59 tonight," I said calmly. "It deletes historical audit entries and reassigns credential attribution." I zoomed into the deletion queue. Legacy Sandbox credential. "That's mine." The compliance officer stepped closer. "Are you suggesting—" "Yes," I replied evenly. The script was structured to frame an outdated test credential as the breach origin, while expanded admin privileges would enable cleanup under his profile. I tapped my phone. The audio clip played through the ballroom speakers. "She doesn't understand Spanish." Brian's voice. Clear. The silence that followed was suffocating. The CEO slowly closed the ceremonial folder. "Signing is suspended pending immediate review," he announced. 2 internal security officers approached Brian. "This is insane," he said, backing away slightly. "She's manipulating logs." "The logs are third-party timestamp verified," I replied calmly. The compliance officer turned to IT security. "Disable any scheduled deletion scripts immediately." My phone vibrated softly. "Purge script disabled by system override." Brian looked around desperately. Natalie began moving toward the exit, but security intercepted her. "We'll need you to remain available," one of them said. I stepped back from the stage, letting corporate legal move forward. Conversations erupted around the room. Phones came out. The projection screen went dark. Brian tried to move toward me, but security stepped between us. "Chloe," he said urgently, his voice no longer confident. "We need to talk." I met his eyes calmly. "No," I said. "We don't," as security escorted him toward a private conference room. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his hand. He glanced at the screen. Whatever he saw drained the last bit of color from his face. My own phone vibrated at the same moment. Mortgage lender update. Fraud investigation opened. The system had begun turning, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to exhale. The silence after the audio clip felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the room fractured into motion. The chief compliance officer stepped forward and quietly instructed IT security to isolate the affected system nodes. Corporate counsel began speaking in urgent, controlled tones near the stage. A few executives moved away from the signing table as if distance alone could shield them from liability. Brian stood frozen in the center of it all. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice no longer smooth. "She's taking personal matters and twisting them." The compliance officer didn't even look at him. "Disable the scheduled deletion script immediately," she said to IT. I glanced at my phone. Purge process. Terminated by system override. The script he had written so carefully would never execute. Natalie tried to slip toward the side exit, but a security guard stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, we'll need you to remain available for documentation," he said calmly. "I'm just a consultant," she insisted, her composure cracking. "This has nothing to do with me." I didn't respond. Instead, I stepped toward corporate legal and handed them a flash drive. All exported logs are timestamp verified through independent forensic validation, I said evenly. The offshore routing paths are documented. So are the structured financial transfers. The attorney took the drive without expression. Is this copy complete? Yes. And preserved? Yes. He nodded once. Across the room, I saw Brian being escorted into a smaller conference area adjacent to the ballroom. His posture had changed completely. His shoulders weren't squared anymore. His movements were sharp, agitated. I felt my phone vibrate again. Email from corporate compliance. Federal reporting procedures initiated due to potential multi-state data exposure. My breath left slowly. He had said Friday would make them clean. Instead, it made it official. Natalie's voice rose slightly as she spoke to a compliance officer. I didn't authorize any exports, she said quickly. I only discussed consulting projections. In Spanish? The officer asked. She hesitated. I watched her swallow. The room had begun to empty as the CEO announced that the signing ceremony was suspended pending immediate review. What had been champagne and handshakes minutes earlier was now controlled chaos. I stepped away from the stage and moved toward a quieter corner near the entrance. My phone vibrated again. Outbound wire. Transaction frozen pending review. The mortgage lender sent a second notification moments later. Fraud inquiry formally opened under primary applicant. Primary applicant. Brian. Everything he had tried to accelerate was now suspended in motion. I leaned against the wall briefly, letting the adrenaline settle into something steadier. Across the ballroom, corporate IT technicians were already reviewing logs on secure tablets. I saw one of them shake his head subtly as he scrolled. The compliance officer approached me again. You understand this will likely trigger a federal inquiry, she said quietly. I do, I replied. Did you access the system recently? Yes, I said calmly. After discovering evidence of financial fraud tied to my identity and unauthorized export activity linked to my credential, all activity is documented and preserved. She studied me for a moment. Thank you for coming forward. I nodded once. Behind her, Brian's voice rose sharply from the conference room. This is insane. She's trying to ruin me. The door closed. A few minutes later, corporate legal stepped into the hallway and made a call. I caught fragments. Mandatory breach reporting, yes. Tonight, restricted dataset involved. Restricted. There was no walking that back. Natalie finally slipped past security once they finished preliminary documentation. Her face pale. She avoided my eyes as she passed. Her phone rang as she reached the exit. She glanced at the screen, then answered quickly in Spanish. ¿Qué pasó? She whispered. I didn't need to hear the rest. Outside the ballroom doors. I opened my phone again. Admin privileges. Active. Deletion script. Permanently disabled pending investigation. Joint account. Temporarily restricted due to suspicious activity. Everything he had built to control the outcome was being dismantled by the same systems he thought he could manipulate. Brian emerged from the conference room escorted by 2 internal security officers. His tie was loosened now. His face looked unfamiliar, tight, drained, uncertain. He spotted me near the exit. Chloe, he said urgently. We need to talk before this spirals. I looked at him calmly. This isn't spiraling, I said. It's documented. He stepped closer. But security shifted subtly between us. You didn't have to do this publicly, he hissed quietly. You tried to do it silently, I replied. For a moment, he looked like he might argue again. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed. I saw the shift immediately, the flicker of understanding. Corporate HR. His badge access would already be suspended. Another notification buzzed on my own phone. Federal compliance inquiry formally opened. I met his eyes one last time in that hallway. The confidence he had worn like armor was gone. He had believed the systems would protect him. He had believed I would remain invisible. Instead, the systems were preserving every detail, and I was walking out of the building without being escorted. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car in the hotel parking structure with the engine off and the city lights reflecting across the windshield. My phone lay in my hand, vibrating again. Brian's voicemail. I let it ring out the first time. The second time, I opened it. Chloe. His voice rushed through the speaker, stripped of the smooth confidence he had worn for years. We need to fix this before it goes too far. They're talking about federal reporting. You don't understand what that means. Call me. I stared at the dashboard, listening to the silence that followed. Federal reporting. I understood exactly what it meant. Before I could put the phone down, a new email appeared from corporate compliance. They thanked me for preserving evidence and informed me that, due to the volume and nature of the exported data, mandatory federal notification protocols had been initiated. Multi-state exposure. I exhaled slowly. This was no longer contained within a ballroom. It was official. I drove home in silence. When I pulled into the driveway, Brian's car wasn't there. Inside, the house felt unfamiliar, quieter than usual, like something essential had already left. I walked into my office and opened the Arizona LLC registry again. An amendment had been filed within the last hour. Ownership structure modification pending. Natalie was trying to distance herself. I clicked into the brokerage account information tied to the LLC. The account status had shifted to review. Transactions frozen. The alliance was cracking. My phone buzzed again. A text from Brian. We need to talk tonight. This is bigger than you think. I didn't respond. An hour later, headlights swept across the living room wall. The front door opened without a knock. Brian stepped inside, his movements sharp and unsteady. What did you do? He demanded, closing the door harder than necessary. I presented evidence, I said calmly. You humiliated me. No, I replied evenly. You did that yourself. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the living room. They're treating this like criminal exposure, he said. It was analytics testing. That's it. Analytics testing doesn't involve restricted clinical trial exports routed offshore. I said. His pacing stopped. You accessed my system, he snapped. That's illegal. I accessed logs tied to my credential and financial accounts after discovering fraudulent activity, I replied. And everything is timestamp verified. He stared at me like he was searching for the version of me he thought he knew. You're blowing this up because of Natalie, he said finally. This is personal. It became personal when you forged my signature, I said. It became criminal when you embedded my credential in your purge script. His jaw tightened. That script was maintenance. It was scheduled to execute at 11:59 p.m. With expanded deletion privileges you activated early, I replied. It included my credential in the deletion queue. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate correction. You don't understand how corporate investigations work. He tried again. If this turns into charges, it ruins both of us. I met his gaze steadily. I separated my assets, I said quietly. And I've retained counsel. The words landed between us. You what? He demanded. I retained counsel. His composure cracked. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice rising. If you cooperate, we can control the narrative. We can say it was a configuration oversight. You drafted that memo already, I replied. The one blaming a legacy test credential. His eyes widened slightly. You went through my files. You tied my identity to a breach you created, I said. I had every reason. He stepped closer. This doesn't have to destroy everything. It already did, I said. My phone buzzed again. Corporate access credentials for Brian Reynolds. Suspended pending investigation. He saw the notification light up in my hand. His face drained. They can't suspend me without... They already did. Silence filled the room. Another vibration. Mortgage fraud investigation opened under primary applicant. He closed his eyes briefly. You didn't have to do this publicly, he said. But the edge in his voice was gone now. It sounded thinner, Desperate. You didn't plan to do it publicly, I replied. You planned to erase it. He lowered his voice. If this turns criminal, they'll look at you too. You configured that sandbox. I preserved evidence of its manipulation, I said calmly. That's the difference. He stared at me for a long moment. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and hesitated. Corporate legal, he answered, stepping toward the hallway for privacy. But his voice carried, Yes, I understand, Monday morning. He ended the call and leaned against the wall. They want me in first thing Monday, he said flatly. I didn't respond. He looked at me again. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. You meant for it to go exactly far enough, I replied. He grabbed his keys abruptly. You're overreacting, he muttered. No, I said quietly. I reacted. He walked out without another word, the front door slamming behind him. I stood in the silent house, listening to the echo settle. A final notification appeared on my phone. Federal compliance inquiry formally logged. I set the phone down slowly. The night I overheard Spanish ended my marriage. Tonight ended his control. Monday morning arrived without ceremony. At 8:15, an email from corporate legal confirmed what I already knew. Brian had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His system credentials were suspended indefinitely. All company-issued devices were to be surrendered for forensic review. I read the message twice. Administrative leave. Indefinitely. A second email followed minutes later from the Healthcare Network's Compliance Division. They requested certified copies of my preserved evidence for formal submission to federal regulators. They provided a secure upload portal and a case reference number. It had a number now. I opened my encrypted archive and began transferring files. Export logs with original metadata. Offshore routing traces. Arizona LLC registry documents. Structured financial transaction records. Purge script configuration and draft internal memo. Spanish email exchange. Audio clip. Each file uploaded with independent timestamp verification attached. As the progress bar moved slowly across my screen, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I answered. Ms. Reynolds, a measured voice asked. This is Special Compliance Investigator Harris. We're reviewing the data exposure incident reported Friday evening. Yes, I said evenly. We understand you preserved relevant logs and documentation. I did. We'll need a formal statement and clarification regarding your system access. I explained calmly how I had discovered financial fraud tied to my identity and unauthorized export activity linked to my credential. I described the purge script scheduled to execute and the independent timestamp verification process. There was a pause. The volume of exported data exceeds minor breach thresholds. Investigator Harris said, This may escalate beyond administrative review. I understand, I replied. When the call ended, I sat still for a moment, absorbing the weight of it. Escalate. By noon, another update arrived. Brian's badge access to the building had been permanently deactivated. At 1:15, a colleague I trusted texted quietly. HR escorted him out this morning. I stared at the message. Escorted. For years. He had walked into that building believing he was indispensable. Now he wasn't even authorized to enter. My phone buzzed again. A public registry alert. The Arizona LLC had filed emergency dissolution paperwork. Natalie was distancing herself. I opened the brokerage account summary tied to the LLC. Transaction status. Restricted. Under review. The structured transfers from our joint account were still frozen. Another call came mid-afternoon. The mortgage lender's fraud department. We've completed preliminary digital signature analysis. The representative said, The electronic signature applied to the home equity application did not originate from your device. I'm aware, I replied calmly. We're formally voiding the application and forwarding documentation to our legal team. Forwarding. It was no longer just a domestic issue. It was paper trails and case numbers. By late afternoon, my inbox contained another notification. Corporate ethics violation notice, preliminary findings. The language was formal, detached, but unmistakable. Unauthorized access to protected health information. Violation of security protocol. Intentional misrepresentation of audit logs. Intentional. At 5:30, Brian finally called. I let it go to voicemail. Then a text appeared. We need to fix this. I can say you misunderstood. I can say it was joint oversight. Joint oversight. I read the message twice. He was still trying to pull me into the narrative he had drafted. I didn't respond. Instead, I scheduled an appointment with my divorce attorney. The meeting was direct. Grounds: financial fraud, economic abuse, attempted liability shift, marital asset manipulation. I provided the mortgage documentation, the structured transfer records, the purge script, the draft memo. My attorney nodded once. You've documented everything thoroughly, she said. This strengthens your position significantly. Philo, I said. We prepared the paperwork that afternoon. When I left the office, the sky was already dark. At 7:42 p.m. Another notification appeared. Federal Inquiry Reference Number assigned. I sat in my car for a moment before driving home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, a familiar car was already parked across the street. Brian. He stepped out before I even reached the front door. They're seizing my laptop tomorrow, he said immediately, skipping any pretense of greeting. This is insane. They're investigating, I replied. They're treating me like a criminal. You treated me like a liability. His expression tightened. If this becomes charges, it ruins everything. It already did, I said quietly. He looked at me like he expected me to soften. I can explain the data routing, he insisted. It was temporary analytics testing. You drafted a memo blaming my credential, I replied. His silence answered for him. I never thought you'd go this far, he said finally. I never thought you would either, I answered. He stared at me for a long moment. Then my phone vibrated again. Notification. Divorce filing submitted. Service pending. I looked at him calmly. I filed, I said. His face changed instantly. You what? It's done. For a second, he seemed unable to process it. Then anger flickered. You're destroying everything. No, I said evenly. I'm ending it. Another vibration. Corporate device seizure scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. I stepped past him toward the door. Chloe, he said sharply. This isn't over. I paused briefly. You're right, I said. It's not. Then I went inside and locked the door behind me. The house felt quieter than it ever had before. Not peaceful, just hollow. By Tuesday morning, Brian's name had been removed from the internal company directory. His profile photo, once displayed proudly on the corporate website, was gone. A blank space where he used to exist. I didn't search for it. Someone sent me a screenshot. Profile not found. At 9 a.m., I received confirmation that his company laptop and access devices had been formally seized for forensic imaging. Corporate security had logged the collection. Chain of custody documentation attached. Chain of custody. The language was clinical. Cold. Unemotional. Exactly how it should be. An hour later, my divorce attorney forwarded confirmation that Brian had been served at his temporary address. He had signed for the documents himself. I imagined his expression when he read the petition. Grounds: financial fraud, economic coercion, identity misuse, intentional exposure of protected data tied to marital liability. There was no ambiguity. At 11:30, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number, I answered cautiously. Miss Reynolds. This is Investigator Harris. We've completed preliminary review of the exported data. I waited. The scope includes restricted clinical trial identifiers and multi-state patient records, he said. This exceeds administrative misconduct. I understand, I replied. We'll be conducting interviews this week. You'll be contacted for formal deposition. I'll cooperate. There was a brief pause on the line. For what it's worth, he added quietly. Your preservation of logs prevented a larger deletion event. I closed my eyes for a moment. Prevention. When the call ended, I sat still, absorbing the shift. This was no longer about marriage. It was federal. By mid-afternoon, a news alert appeared on a local business site. Healthcare network delays major IT contract due to internal security investigation. No names. Not yet. But the ripple had begun. Another message came in, this time from Natalie. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment before responding. About what? Her reply came quickly. I didn't know about the data. I thought it was just consulting. He told me you were unstable. Unstable. I typed slowly. You confirmed financial transfers and relocation plans in writing? There was no response for several minutes. Then, I didn't think it was illegal. I didn't reply again. By evening, Brian called 3 times. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the shared financial account dashboard. Status: restricted pending investigation. The structured transfers he had routed toward the Arizona entity were still frozen. The mortgage application had been voided. My independent assets remained untouched. He had tried to rewrite the ledger. The ledger hadn't cooperated. At 7:20 p.m., headlights swept across my living room again. I didn't move toward the window this time. The doorbell rang. Then pounding. Chloe. Brian's voice cut through the quiet. Open the door. I didn't respond. The pounding intensified. They're making this criminal, he shouted. You could stop this. I walked calmly to the door but did not unlock it. Stop what? I asked through the wood. The escalation, he snapped. If you tell them you misunderstood the logs, I didn't. You're destroying my career. You destroyed it when you wrote that purge script. Silence fell for a moment on the other side. You're angry, he said, lowering his tone. This is revenge. No, I replied quietly. It's consequence. He exhaled sharply. I never meant for it to go this far. You meant for it to go far enough. I said. There was a long pause. Then his voice shifted. If charges come down, he said, they'll freeze everything. Assets. Accounts. You think you'll walk away untouched. My attorney disagrees. The silence that followed felt heavier. You filed for divorce, he said finally. Yes. He let out a bitter laugh. You planned this. I prepared. I corrected. Another pause. I can't lose everything, he said quietly. And for the first time, it didn't sound like anger. It sounded like fear. You already did, I replied. His hand hit the door once more, not in anger this time, but in frustration. Then footsteps retreated. I waited until I heard his car engine start before stepping away. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Local court docket update. Temporary protective order request filed. My attorney had moved quickly after I forwarded Brian's earlier messages. By 9:30 p.m., a confirmation email arrived. Hearing scheduled. I sat down at my desk and opened the folder labeled Evidence Preserved. Every log, every timestamp, every financial trace. For years, Brian had assumed silence meant ignorance. He had mistaken calm for weakness. He had mistaken privacy for lack of awareness. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Another notification appeared on my phone. Federal subpoena request drafted. I read the words slowly. Drafted. The narrative he tried to control was no longer his. And this time, there was no script he could delete. 6 months later, I signed the final divorce decree without hesitation. The courtroom was quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to everything that had led there. The judge reviewed the documentation, confirmed the uncontested findings of financial fraud and economic misconduct, and granted the dissolution, primary assets retained by petitioner, joint liabilities reassigned based on documented misconduct. Protective order extended. It was official. Brian wasn't present in the courtroom. His attorney appeared alone, thin-lipped and exhausted. I had learned weeks earlier that Brian had formally been charged under federal statutes related to unauthorized access and unlawful export of protected health information. The word charged had once felt abstract. Now it was printed across official filings with his name beneath it. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clear and brutally bright. My attorney shook my hand once. "Firm and professional. You handled this strategically," she said. "Most people respond emotionally. You documented—" I nodded. Documentation had been my shield. 2 months after the initial inquiry, the healthcare network had publicly acknowledged a data breach involving a former IT support employee. His name wasn't hidden anymore. Industry publications ran quiet but pointed summaries. Internal control failures. Unauthorized credential usage. Attempted deletion of audit trails. Attempted deletion. That phrase appeared in every report. Natalie had disappeared from the narrative entirely. Her name surfaced briefly in investigative notes, but without formal charges. She had resigned from her clinic within weeks of the scandal and, according to registry records, relocated out of state. Distance didn't erase timestamps. Brian's trial date had been set for later in the year. His bond conditions restricted system access, financial transfers, and international travel. The Arizona LLC had dissolved under investigation. The mortgage fraud filing had been voided permanently. The structured transfers remained frozen as evidence. The system he tried to manipulate had preserved everything instead. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I accepted a position as Chief Technology Officer at a healthcare cybersecurity startup in Denver. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our entire mission centered on protecting patient data from internal misuse. On my first day, I stood in a conference room filled with engineers and compliance analysts and outlined our philosophy clearly. "Security isn't about fear," I said. "It's about accountability." They nodded. I knew exactly what it meant when systems failed from inside. My life in Denver was quiet. Intentional.
Ordered.
The house I rented overlooked the foothills. Mornings were filled with code reviews and strategic planning sessions instead of whispered phone calls behind closed doors. I kept my financial accounts separate. Transparent? Logged. Trust, I had learned, wasn't the absence of oversight. It was the presence of integrity. Sometimes, late at night, I would replay that Wednesday in my mind. The half-closed office door. The Spanish phrases drifting through the hallway. He doesn't understand Spanish. He had been so certain. Not just about the language. About me. He had believed I wouldn't check logs. Wouldn't question structured transfers. Wouldn't understand system privileges. Wouldn't act. Silence had protected him for years. Until it didn't. One evening, I received a final notification regarding the federal case. Plea agreement filed. Brian had accepted a negotiated settlement to avoid extended trial proceedings. Limited prison time. Heavy fines. Permanent disqualification from working in regulated healthcare IT environments. Permanent. His career in the field he once claimed mastery over was over. I didn't feel triumph reading it. I felt closure. He had tried to erase me from his future. Instead, he erased himself from his own. Months later, during a cybersecurity conference, a young analyst approached me after my presentation. "How did you know something was wrong?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. I listened. I said, not just to the words spoken in another language, to the gaps, to the numbers that didn't align, to the scripts scheduled too precisely, to the confidence that felt rehearsed. Listening had been the beginning. Acting had been the difference. Back in my apartment that night, I stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker across the skyline. Revenge, I had learned, wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about public spectacle. It wasn't about anger. Revenge was about truth documented so thoroughly that denial collapsed under its own weight. It was about protecting yourself before someone else rewrote your story. Brian thought I didn't understand Spanish. He thought I didn't understand systems. He thought I wouldn't understand him. He was wrong on every count. If you've ever been underestimated, If you've ever been told you don't understand, remember this. Silence is not ignorance. Preparation is not weakness. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to listen carefully. Gather evidence quietly, and wait until the right moment to speak. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in accountability, integrity, and never letting yourself be erased, stay with this channel. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever uncovered a hidden truth simply by listening? I read every comment. And if you want more stories about hidden power, betrayal, and the moment the tables turn, subscribe and stay tuned. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.